Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Kilic Kanat, and I'm the research director at SETA Foundation in Washington, D.C. And today we have a panel discussion on what happened in the Middle East, what's happening. And in the last 10 days, after the starting of the attacks on Iran by Israel, there was a military escalation in the region, diplomatic attempts that failed. Then there was a lot of debate on the US involvement to the issue. And following the bombing of Fordo by Fordo Natanz by US, it basically started to cool down a little bit. Iran's retaliation to the region was considered more symbolic than anything else. But now today we have a ceasefire, and we don't know how firm is this ceasefire. According to many experts, it's extremely fragile. We will discuss what happened in the last 10 days and potential ramification of this to the Middle East and, of course, to the globe. And we have Alex Vatanka with us, and Daniel Levy will join us shortly. Alex, let's discuss with you. Let's start with you and tell us what happened and tell us the perspective on the Iran side, actually. What is, for example, the current state of Iran's nuclear program? There's a lot of debate on that. And what do you think about the debate within among the agencies almost in the US about the success of the US attack to Fordo?
Well, first, great to be with you. I look forward to our conversation. Always a pleasure. Look, in terms of where Iran is, Ayatollah Khamenei obviously came out just a few hours ago and gave a speech declaring that Iran having won, as he put it. And I mean, I guess the headline from his speech was that had it not been for the United States, Israel would no longer be here. So it was the kind of speech that we've come to kind of expect from Ali Khamenei, the leader since 1989. I felt that he wasn't exactly harsh in his language towards the United States. There were references to President Trump, but nothing venomous, nothing that he couldn't roll back. That to me was interesting. If I had to read between the lines, that means perhaps, the diplomatic track really isn't dead. And I know a lot of folks are talking about, there is no diplomacy as far as Iran's nuclear program is concerned. Now, they've just been struck by two nuclear armed countries. What are you talking about? But there are folks in Tehran who are still, at least in terms of words, expressing a desire to go back to a diplomatic process if it's a credible one. And that's the big question mark. At this point, if you're in Tehran, why would you trust the United States? At this point, and you just pointed it out, the ceasefire is fragile. The Qataris, my understanding is, played the main role here mediating. I don't know if there's, much small print in around or behind this ceasefire. But what I see Iranian officials, and I just saw Hassan Rouhani, former president, make that point, constantly making references to the Israeli Hezbollah ceasefire. In other words, underscoring that this could fall apart any minute, that the nation should be ready, should not feel comfortable in this space, in this ceasefire moment. But I mean, look, I think at this point, a couple of other points I make. Khamenei's relevance also has to be essentially questioned. He has given a speech, but my understanding is, and I know some folks here in DC and maybe elsewhere are saying Iran's going to come out of this stronger because the regime wasn't toppled, which many people say was the ultimate objective behind certainly the Israeli surprise attacks on the 13th of June. That is true. The regime didn't topple. And that's significant. That shows you something in terms of the capacity of the regime to stand on its 2 feet. But at the same time, why we got into this mess in the first place really is the big question for most Iranians, and I think including Iranian analysts, and I would say probably a good part of the Iranian state machinery. The two elements in Iran that are responsible for what happened, both in terms of being party to inciting the Israelis because of their ideology, but also not being able to prepare the country for what happened, for the disaster that happened. I mean, I don't think we should underestimate what happened here in terms of the disaster that it was for Iran. The capital of the country is under attack constantly for days in and days out, and they are not able to defend the capital. There's no two ways about it. And who's responsible for that? Again, it's the supreme leader, I think, and his ideological outlook in life, and the Revolutionary Guards, who, for so many years promised that nothing bad could really happen because Israel is so far away and we have air defenses and, we are not Hezbollah. The Israelis wouldn't dare, but they did dare, and they came back by the United States. And that, I think, is going to be the reason why some of these fundamental debates will happen. Now, early signs of what they're going to do, things like suspending cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, or some folks saying they should leave the nuclear proliferation treaty or even go for the bomb. Obviously, I don't take any of these that much seriously in the short term. Not in the short term, because I still think that the diplomatic track, if it's a viable one, and that's, again, another big question mark. What diplomatic track? I mean, what are they going to negotiate over? If they claims that these nuclear sites were destroyed is true, then, the diplomatic track can certainly not be just centered around the nuclear issue at this point. It has to be something much broader than that. For now, Khamenei remains the key decision maker. Now that he's back from his hiding place, and he has to answer for why Iran was not ready for this 12-day war. And he has to also prepare public opinion against this notion that Iran is so weak that the dismantlement of the country at the hands of Israel and the United States is just a question of time. These are the types of fears people are expressing. People are making comparisons to the weak Qajar dynasty of the 18th, 17th to 19th century, that, they were so weak technologically that, the Russians took good parts of northern Caucasus away from Iran, from Persia at the time. So there's a real sense of anxiety in Iranian society in terms of go forward. And, I have no idea which decision fundamentally will be made in terms of doubling down, staying the course, rebuilding the missile arsenal and all the rest of it, or taking this, again, disaster that happened to Iran as reason for making a swift, sharp turn away from the past, which, at this point is unlikely to be expressed officially, but might be able to be something that they can do in practice going forward. So essentially changing the policies without announcing that they're about to change their policies. But I guess I'll stop here, and I'll leave it to you to take it from here.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, and we will come back with many questions from about what you said. Daniel, let's come to you and tell us the Israeli perspective, and what do you think about the perspective of the Israeli public and the government about what happened in the last 10 days?
I'm not there, but I can give you my read on things, and it's good to be with you and to be with SETA on this. There was, as people will be familiar, a very consensual narrative that spanned the Israeli Jewish political establishment, the security establishment, and the public. And it is something that they have absorbed and barely questioned, actually, for many decades. And Netanyahu, for more than 3 decades, has, and he's often been prime minister during that time, has probably been the cheerleader of this narrative, which is that Iran poses an existential threat to Israel. The region has to be exclusively seen through the Iranian lens, through this fight as they see it with Iranian evil. I said in the Jewish Israeli, the Zionist political establishment and spectrum, because even as we saw during polling during these 12 days, if you ask the 20% of the Israeli citizens who are Palestinian, they were not supportive of what was going on. It's a different view. Leaving aside for a moment the veracity of that claim, leaving aside how real was the existential threat. Israel has a nuclear weapon, Iran doesn't. Of course, there's the question of what was the purpose of those forces, movements supported by Iran in Israel's immediate neighborhood. Were they designed as a defensive ring or as an offensive ring? They, especially in the case of Hezbollah, were very significantly defanged during this last period. But what I'm saying is that Israeli society was very primed, was very prepared to rally around this. So there weren't too many questions asked. And it's important to point that out because Netanyahu is an incredibly divisive figure inside Israel. Really, society breaks down along the lines of pro or anti-Netanyahu. They don't break down along the lines of pro or anti what Israel's doing to the Palestinians or pro or anti the attack launched on Iran. And so this was a unifying thing. It ends, and we're in many respects, probably more than one could have anticipated, back in the everything is divisive. So, of course, the military wants to play up what they have achieved. This is a military still trying to reassert its credibility after the failures of October 7th. It went a long way towards that in Lebanon, perhaps, but it hasn't really achieved that in Gaza. On the day where the ceasefire was announced, coincided with a day of a significant loss for Israel of 7 soldiers in Gaza. They haven't vanquished. There hasn't been the total victory against Hamas. No white flags raised, etc. So, given that Israel threw everything at this, given how unified people were, they want this victory. But, and the but is significant, and the but comes from a few places. The but comes from someone I think was mentioned just now, but maybe not because I've been doing too many things today. But they absorbed hits that were not something Israel has gotten used to. Okay, these strikes were significant, and I think what is important here is there is not a symmetry of pain thresholds between the two societies. Right, the two societies have a, if you want to call it, a resilience level. Yeah, Iran, it's a different generation now, but there will certainly be the generational memory of the Iran-Iraq war. There's also been the living under sanctions. Israel is different. So Israeli society was, I think, somewhat shaken by what happened. Number two, they, like anyone else, can read, and they are exposed to these very divergent assessments on how successful was this. Israel, you had a very clear impression that after just 10, 11, 12, but even earlier on days, there were questions about, is Israel running out of interceptor missiles? But also about how much Israel could sustain a war of attrition. So Israel's staying power was under question. And then the president of the United States, in his own singular way, turned around and in putting a post on Truth Social, where he called for the court case against the Israeli prime minister to be dropped, because that's really his thing to decide and to comment on. But in so doing, he said, and I quote, "It was the United States of America that saved Israel." Hello. That's not a narrative Israelis have been told fits the realities. What's going on? Our prime minister has always told us we will defend ourselves by ourselves. You saved us? Oh, shit. What does that mean about our vulnerabilities? So it's really interesting listening to Alex, because there's something of a mirror image here, right? You have leaders giving their victory narratives. Hubris, when you're in power an awfully long time, sometimes when you're not in power very long at all, is a thing that you tend to indulge in. And I think that's what we're experiencing. And so you now have, interestingly enough, a conversation again coming to the fore in Israel of we're exhausted, a cohort of Israel saying enough, let's end all the wars. This is exhausting. Why haven't you dealt with the Israelis being held in Gaza? And you have a cohort who are saying, well, now that the war with Iran is finished, let's double down on what we do in Gaza. In fact, we didn't do enough with Iran. And so that division has re-emerged. And there is a nagging doubt, I think, just as with Gaza. Does Israel have a plan for the morning after? Does Israel know how to do politics? Can you take whatever military success you may have achieved and translate it into sustainable political capital? And Netanyahu, I think, is telling the Americans, now we've removed Iran. That was the problem in the region, right? We've removed Iran, so now we can have normalization, and now we can give the Palestinians nothing and maybe ethnically cleanse more of them, but that doesn't matter. We can pretend that we're finished now with the Palestinians. Netanyahu doesn't intend to do that. The region isn't going to buy it. And Netanyahu, he has a real dilemma because he organized his politics around the Iranian threat. He organized his positioning in the region around the Iranian threat. And if he buys his own spin and the Iranian threat has been vanquished, well, the rest of the region is going to turn around and say, great, can you stop doing this to the Palestinians and give them some kind of hope now, because you're messing up our region. Our public gets radicalized. The region gets destabilized. We don't want them watching pictures of this genocide every day. Netanyahu decentered the Palestinians by deploying Iran. If that's gone, an organizing principle has gone, and he doesn't have a replacement.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And in the meantime, we start to receive some questions. So I will start asking those before I ask my questions, so that first the audience questions are answered. The first question is to Alex. Alex, there's a question, do you believe a diplomatic return to JCPOA? You in somehow responded this, but the second part of the question is, if not, what alternatives exist for Iran?
Look, I mean, at this point, you could make the argument that JCPOA obviously is no longer relevant. Once you have the situation you have, where the United States taking action unilaterally, IEA, frankly, UN, none of these entities matter at this point. So if you're Iran and your bottom line is, I can't go to war with the United States, what option do you have other than having a resumption of diplomacy with the US, but one that is not just centered on the nuclear issue, to deal with other concerns? It doesn't have to be a one-way street. The Iranians can, can demand or ask for at least certain, rewards. Maybe reward is not the right word, but something back in return. I mean, focusing here primarily on sanctions, because they have always wanted some realistic lifting of sanctions, and not just a promise of lifting of sanctions on paper, which they say was the case with 2015 JCPOA. A lot of promises made, but not delivered. So they will be asking for something that is measurable in terms of sanctions relief. But in my case, I've been making the point that the reason why JCPOA fell apart, or Trump was able to walk away from it, was because the conversation was so narrow between Tehran and Washington. It needed to involve the region. It needed to involve issues like Israel. And let me just say this as well, because Daniel brought up a very important point about Bibi Netanyahu. Look, if those of us who support the two-state solution, we, regardless of how you come to that conclusion, I've come to that conclusion because there's lack of alternative, right? And Bibi Netanyahu has for so long said that's not the problem. The Palestinians are not the problem. It's the mothership, the snake, the octopus, whatever you want to call it. That's the problem. So let's just say that problem has now been resolved, for now at least. That's what the American side is saying. That's what the Israelis are telling us. Then what do you do? How do you then justify, again, to Daniel's point, not going back and trying the political process with the Palestinians? If you can do that, if that starts soon, I think it would help immensely in deciding where Iran chooses to go. Those hardliners who might right now be whispering in the ear of Ali Khamenei saying, the lesson, sir, we should take is that we need to weaponize, we need to spend more money on the proxies, we need to go after the Israelis harder than ever before. Those people will, if there is a political process, a viable one, involving the Palestinians and the Israelis, will have a tougher time making that point to Khamenei and certainly to the Iranian people, for a majority of whom what Iran is doing in the region is something they do not approve of. So many different balls right now in the air. I don't know if we get to talk. I mean, the region was mentioned, and Daniel talked about new regional realities. Totally agree. Maybe we can get to that later. Maybe I'll leave my answer at that, and then maybe we get to a later point.
Alex, another question to you, which is related to great power involvement to this. I'll ask the US part to Daniel Levy, but I want to ask the Russia and China part to you. The question is Iran felt abandoned by Russia and China because of their reactions to these 10 to 12 days war?
It was a total defeat for Khamenei's worldview that said, if we get closer to Russia and China, what the so-called look east policy of Ali Khamenei for the last 20 years, if we go closer to Russia and China, and they certainly did that in the last few years, they've joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, strategic agreements signed only a few months ago this year between Moscow and Tehran. So on paper, it looked like, pretty lavish. So much cooperation between Iran and Russia, and certainly with China too. But once the conflict erupted on the 13th of June, and Iran was looking around to see who would be on its side, there weren't any. Not even the proxies amounted to much. They might have wanted to take some shots at the US bases around the region, but it wouldn't have changed the strategic outlook. So absolutely, there is a strategic loneliness that Iran finds itself in. Would they go back and try and see if they can do better in a new round? I hope not, because when Putin was asked what he could do for Iran, basically he said, let's pray for Iran. That doesn't amount to much. The United States didn't pray for Israel. The United States gave Israel what it wanted to achieve its objectives. Now, good or bad, I mean, you can criticize what the Trump administration did on a whole host of levels. I mean, people are already declaring non-proliferation treaty dead. Proliferation is going to be a very different beast going forward because of what the US did. Those are different arguments. But my point to your question is, Russia and China were not able to or unwilling to help Iran. And that puts Iran in a different place, I think, when it has to make a decision in terms of where do I go from here in terms of my foreign policy and geopolitical priorities.
And Daniel, the US part to you, what do you think this conflict will change, how it will change the US-Israeli relations? Is now the deterrence policy that Israel followed will be totally transformed, that would include a US direct support, or is it going to be same? And how does this affect the decision of Trump, affect the interagency rivalries and domestic divisions in the US about Israel?
Yeah, if I may just start, really interesting listening to Alex, and you can flip that equation a little bit, because as you're speaking, I'm thinking, wow, Iran, glorious isolation, Israel had America, had other NATO countries involved in its defense, providing intelligence, trying to prevent those missiles, had Arab states. They didn't want to make a song and dance of it, certainly its neighbor Jordan, the American interceptors based there. It's an interesting one because the missiles still got through, because you had all of this, and yet the regime's there. Israel upped the ante, went up the escalation ladder, talked about regime change. Nothing happened until the last minute, and maybe after the last minute as well. The Iranians were able to send stuff that hit Israel. So it's an interesting one. I would also say that the relationship with China is fundamentally different to the relationship with Russia on the Iranian side. It was never seen as a strategic that could have included the military component. If I were guessing and betting, I would say the side of the Iranian equation that says now we have to see what we can do with the West is not going to be the one that wins out. The side of the Iranian equation that says where do we go wrong in not deepening those relations more? Because they're going to be looking at the shifting geopolitics, and the geopolitics is not shifting in America's favor, if you ask me. And I don't think there's going to be a negotiating track back to anything. I think what America will insist on in negotiations is not something Iran can agree to. By the way, I think if everyone's smart, they'll say there's nothing we need to negotiate now. According to the Americans and the Israelis, it's all done. There's no nuclear program that poses any threat. Fine, but let's not get ourselves, because Trump, if Trump goes into a negotiation, the impression you have at least is that if it doesn't succeed in something very quickly, and I don't think there's any negotiation, there's no zone of potential agreement, at least between Israel and Iran in terms of what the outcome should be, and the Israelis will have some influence over the Americans, then Trump will get fed up with it quite quickly and will be back in a more dangerous place. I think that has an implication for the Europeans and where the snapback of the UN regarding sanctions is brought back in. But your question, Kilic, which I avoided until now, and I will now answer briefly, was about how does this all play out with America and Israel. And I think that something very important went on, and we mustn't overinterpret it in at least one way. The important thing that went on is this moment of apparent stunning success where Israel brought America, where Netanyahu got America to do the thing that it had not done previously in terms of bombing Iran, there are a lot of clouds surrounding that silver lining, because it was combined with something that was a one-off, and it was combined with this very significant moment on the American political right, where Israel, doing something military for Israel, going for the Israeli interest, became controversial. One of the stories of American politics of the last generation is that Israel became controversial on the Democratic side, and then it almost, among voters and the base, it's not even that controversial anymore. I mean, the polling is so steered towards enough. Why are we giving Israel all this support? Why don't we sanction it? What is this relationship with this apartheid state? The nature of the corruption of the Democrat establishment and leadership means that Democrat electeds, when they're given the role of super PACs and all the rest of it, still more often than not do the opposite of what their voters want them to do. But that was matched on the other side by a strong consensus on the GOP side. And suddenly you had America first pitted against Israel first. And that breakdown in consensus, the way in which that emerged and became such a prominent thing, so openly discussed, may end up being more important for Israel and the region than how deep some bomb penetrated Fordow, yes or no. Where I want to now draw a line onto what I said and put in a note of caution is that you still have no constituency on the Republican side really effectively in it for the Palestinians. There's no love. That doesn't translate into any understanding of love for willingness to put yourself on the line for the Palestinians. Partly that's to do with the Palestinians having a political national movement leadership, which is totally co-opted. But that's also part of the story of where we are.
Thank you very much, Daniel. There's another question about one audience asked about the Abraham Accords. Has the recent conflict strengthened or strained the Abraham Accords? And the question is referring, I guess, to a poster today in Tel Aviv about the Abraham Accords. So I see that, but probably the audience, for those who didn't see that, there was this poster apparently in Tel Aviv that is asking for the continuation of the Abraham Accords with all other Arab countries, and including Syria, interesting.
If Alex starts the answer, then I'll share the picture with the
Sure.
screen.
Go ahead.
Or at least I'll hold it up from my phone.
Sure.
So I thank you, Daniel, for that. I can't claim to be somebody who tracks the ins and outs of the Abraham Accords, but I would suspect that obviously it's been under much pressure in the last couple of years because of the situation in Gaza. Would it be expanded now that Israel has taken out Iran militarily? I said that's a great question. I mean, I can just point to the prime example. The prime focus for all of us, I think, when it comes to the expansion of Abraham Accords, which is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And when I look at Saudi Arabia, I have seen nothing to indicate that what happened just about the last few weeks has made them want to join the Abraham Accords any more than they did before. Probably opposite is more true. I think the Saudis are probably concerned as well. What a lot of countries in the region are concerned about what just happened in terms of, not because they love the Islamic Republic of Iran, but the idea that Israel is able to basically militarily take on anybody in the region is a reality that countries like Saudi Arabia, others in the Arab world, Turkey, need to take into account. Kilic, as you know, Turkish media have been full of speculation. Is Turkey next for Israel, right? So that's the spirit in the region in some ways. And that doesn't necessarily suggest that Abraham Accords is the only way forward. They might come to the conclusion that to make friends with Israel is the best way forward, but maybe some countries would make reach a different conclusion. So I certainly, as somebody who I always thought Abraham Accords is a good thing, because countries economically integrating in the region, I think it's a good thing fundamentally. But the politics is not going to go away. The Palestinian issue is not going to go away. That's obviously remains a key challenge for the expansion of Abraham Accords. And I would just, again, final point is what just happened with US and Israel going after Iran might raise its own questions in terms of the future of this region and how countries should be aligning up to best protect their own national interest, if you will.
So that's the image.
Yeah.
So you have Trump in the center, Mohammed bin Salman and Netanyahu either side. You have to go too along until you get to the Palestinian president Abbas, and the Jordanian king has kind of just been clipped onto the far corner of this image. So as someone who was always against the Abraham Accords, not because I don't believe in better relations, but because looking at it from the Israeli side, there was an intentional design feature to the Abraham Accords, which was, this is a piece to marginalize the Palestinians. And the countries who signed those deals did so with malice of forethought when it came to that issue. And I wouldn't draw a causal line in thick marker pen between the Abraham Accords and the unprecedented bloodshed and instability which prevails today. But I think it was a contributory factor, because the Abraham Accords were an important moment of solidifying Netanyahu's message to the Israeli public that we have absolute impunity. We can act with even more extremity and hubris, and that is exactly how it played out. I do not think, and there are reports to the contrary, right now coming out in the Israeli media, and there's been a statement by Witkoff, but I do not think we're on the precipice of another breakthrough in the Abraham Accords. I think the Israeli Prime Minister is in this very particular relationship with Trump, where he gets insulted one moment. I mean, I guess it's not unique to the Israeli Prime Minister, right? When it comes to Trump, and he gets insulted one moment, and then the next moment there's the tweet, drop the court case against him. But I think what Netanyahu has done is said to the Americans, okay, now we've defeated Iran, we can move ahead, have normalization. If the Arabs come in and take Gaza, then I can leave a lot of Gaza. But you have to kick out a lot of the Palestinians. I might have to annex some of the West Bank, by the way, but I'm sure the Arabs will be fine with that. What could possibly go wrong? So I think he's basing a lot on a reasonable estimation of the depth of substance and familiarity that this administration have with the region, which I'm suggesting is very shallow. So I don't think we're on the precipice of that. Israel is not ready to do anything constructive, positive, actually not based on further removal and structural violence against Palestinians that will enable that to go forward. I do think an interesting question is to what extent do other state actors in the region see Israel as a more disruptive force than Iran now? To what extent does that insurance policy of being a first mover in deepening relations with Israel look like a good idea? I think for some it might still. And that question of how do you get Israel back in a box where it's manageable? I don't think anyone has a good answer to that. But when that question is asked, and you kind of touched on it, Alex and Kilic, each country will now have to make a decision. Do I need to revisit also my defensive and offensive military capacities, my national security doctrines? I think that's going to be very relevant to Turkey amongst others. And that was a remarkable. So there's an Israeli news channel, and I'll finish with this, Channel 14. It's quite influential. It's very close to the Prime Minister. It's become part of his media machine. Its leadership should probably at some stage be in The Hague, as Radio Rwanda was some years ago after the genocide there, for having promoted and incited genocide against the Palestinians. But on this one instance, you had one of their main characters on that channel come in and say, look, he did a football analogy. He said, we had a hard match against Hamas in the quarterfinals, and we just won on penalties. He said, actually, we had an easy semi-final against Iran. This was on like the second day after the Israeli strike. We had an easy win in the semi-finals against Iran, and that means we're now in the final against Turkey. So this is the real country we now have to take down in the region. So this is, as we see what's going on in Syria, I'm not saying he speaks for the center of gravity of the Israeli system, but this is part of the mix of considerations for everyone.
Thank you very much. Daniel, I will come back to you with another question about Palestine, but before that, Alex, there's a question about the potential impact of this war to NPT process, overall Iran's nuclear program and its willingness to weaponize its nuclear program. I know that you said there is a division between two different groups in regards to nuclear program in Iran. Give us a little more detail on that and how other countries are impacted by this war in regards to NPT process.
No, I mentioned earlier that there are those voices that are speaking of leaving NPT, and you can't trust the international organizations, all the rest of it. End of the day, at this point, right this moment, I don't think they're going to win the argument in Tehran. Fundamentally, the Iranians are going to be in the next, weeks, months probably, playing the role I'm not playing. I mean, they can claim with some legitimacy that they weren't the rogue actor in the sense of the actual war, that they were attacked, right? So they want to keep the attention on what they say the aggressor, in this case, Israel and US. For them to pull out of NPT, which, by the way, their close friends in Russia have advised against, and I'm sure the same is probably true for the Chinese, might just muddy the waters when it comes to the good guy, bad guy equation, if you will. So Iran wants to be seen as the good guys, the reasonable ones, that do everything reasonably, including how they retaliate. They call you in advance. They tell you that part of the base is where we're going to land that missile. Please get you people away. But it's not just being nice. It's because fundamentally they don't want to go into conflict with the United States. That's what it is. And let me just take Israel out of the equation for a second. Let's just focus on the power they really worry about. It's the United States. So US has taken out these sites. Iran might have those 408 kilograms that we don't know the whereabouts, and they could turn in around and have a crude nuclear bomb. Is that the best course of action for them? Again, questions like, so you have a bomb, what does it actually do in the face of an America right now that at any moment could re-enter the war, at any moment, particularly with a president like Donald Trump? There's nothing holding him back. He's not going to take his case to the UN. He'll meet with his people and the Pentagon and say, what can we do? And if you're the Iranian regime, where you wake up in the hours of the 13th of June and dozens of your senior leaders are all taken out, what lesson do you take? The lesson is you're badly, badly infiltrated. That the same organizations, presumably Mossad and other organizations that have all this information on your senior leadership, their whereabouts, how you take them out, might very likely also discover if you dash in for a bomb. Again, you're given reason for the United States to re-enter the war. So for those reasons, I'm sure if they could get away with it, there might be a real desire to weaponize, if for nothing then to get back at the United States. Say, we sign all those deals and you walked away from JCPOA, you don't play by the rules. But that's not where they are in terms of the hard realities they face when it comes to Donald Trump in the White House and his willingness to go back. Because one thing Donald Trump, as we all know, does not like is to look weak and incompetent. And if he's told that your bombing mission didn't kill the Iranian nuclear program, but here we have the final evidence, you got to do this last part here, he might just buy into it. And Iran doesn't want to see the US return. But in terms of very quickly what NPT regime means for other countries, the rest of the world, I mean, that's the big question mark. I've been saying in the last few days, that's the big question mark. The beauty of the US Air Force being in operation, nobody can question in terms of what they achieved, flying out of Missouri to hit targets and go back home, having turkey sandwiches on the way. But the damage is, if you believe in international order, if you believe in rules governing how countries go about their lives, if you believe in that, and some people don't. Some people think, I was on C-SPAN yesterday. Most callers were calling and saying it's all about projecting hard power. So these people respect us. If that's your approach, then, that's your approach. But others around the world might also feel somewhat stimulated, if you will, by that. It's okay. It's all about hard power. So the Iranians did it the wrong way. Maybe we should follow the North Korean model. Maybe we should play nice but quietly build a bomb. So who knows what happens with this regime? But the ideas that sort of foundations for the international institutions, law and order, that has been created since Second World War, right now, probably one could make the argument, are being tested unlike any time, certainly in recent years. So let me stop there.
Now,
Go ahead.
if I may make one quick comment, then I have to leave. So I'll leave you after this comment. I would just add that it was interesting to me, and I don't think he'll be a lone voice in this respect. I think this is going to emerge more and more. On the day when the ceasefire was announced, or the literally the morning after, I think, and obviously when there had been the missiles launched on for all the forewarning on sovereign Qatari territory, Lebanon's prime minister was in Doha, and his first comment was, "We need to have a WMD-free Middle East." It's not the first time we've heard that, of course, and of course Israel is a nuclear armed state. Iran isn't. And you don't have a model, really, of regional stability. You don't have many instances of it. So there's a question around North Korea, still relatively new. In South Asia, both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. In the Middle East, it's just Israel. South Korea has a certain alliance with the US. So there's a real question here of, are we going to have a nuclear free-for-all, or are we going to have a nuclear-free zone? And I would not be surprised if there's ever another serious attempt at negotiation, there will be more of a microscope put on the Israeli side of this equation. And I will just leave you with that thought. Thank you. I apologize, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. And Alex, we have two last questions to you. And the first question is about the US support for Israel and its global image. It says, how has the US support for Israel during the Iran conflict affected its image in the Middle East and global South? Is Washington seen as a stabilizing force or an enabler of another escalation?
It's again, very important timely question. I wish we had more data to go by. All I can point to are the sort of images I'm sure everybody saw. There were some where it looked like the U.S. was going into a larger war with Iran. Briefly, there were demonstrations across many cities around the world, demanding that didn't happen, that the U.S. didn't go into war with Iran. We don't know, as far as I can tell, other than there has been a swing here in the United States when you look at the data before the U.S. actually striking those nuclear sites, where the opposition was greater than the after, when it was successfully done, and the president said that was the end of it. In other words, it seems like U.S. public opinion that was against U.S. intervening in a war has more tolerance for very limited operations, particularly involving a country like Iran, which in American, daily terms, it's seen as an enemy of the United States because of 46 years of slogans against the United States. So as soon as people here realized the strikes were very limited and successful, you saw the poll numbers showing more support what the president did. Had it been the other way around, had it been involving boots on the ground, American, military having to be deployed and billions of dollars being spent, it would have been a different matter. But in all that, I haven't seen anyone discussing the damage done to the image of the United States around the world, the global South. I suspect that supporters of President Trump will point to the upside of this, saying this is the kind of operation that gets people to fear you and come and talk to you with respect. I mean, that's what you're hearing. The Democrats on the other side will probably say America has always been great because it's been able to involve itself and operate as part of a larger international coalition. And when you isolate yourself, then your options going forward will be limited. That's the traditional argument. I was listening to Secretary General of NATO yesterday, and this whole thing about daddy came up, which sort of raises the issue. Even if the Europeans feel that the type of American power projection is what you need to get things done, like the Iran challenge, maybe even the Ukraine challenge. We saw how former President Medvedev of Russia rolled it back when he first kind of teased, trying to provoke Trump by saying Russia might give nuclear warheads to Iran. Trump hit back saying, now I know why you're not the boss. Medvedev had to come back, and he didn't apologize. We had to say that he wasn't serious when he said that. In other words, there are plenty of folks here in the United States, maybe in Europe and elsewhere, who actually have a lot more time for Trump's approach to international diplomacy. That you've been unpredictable, the madman theory and all the rest of it is actually what you need to get things done around the world. But as I said, it's really early to see if what happened in Iran with the nuclear sites actually was going to pay off. We know that Trump made a strategic bet in 2018 when he walked away from the nuclear deal. That strategic bet did not pay off. We know that. That's beyond doubt. Will this one pay off? That is a big question mark. Obviously, the Iranians have a lot to say because their next decision is one they have to make. And yet, for the next 3.5 years, they have an American president who is unpredictable. So they have to take that into account. And as I said, their bottom line is survival of the country as it is and the survival of the regime. And that's going to always act as a restrainer, if you will, in terms of what they are willing to risk vis-a-vis the United States.
Alex, the last question.
Yeah.
Trump has suggested that the US would help Saudi Arabia develop nuclear weapons. Should this be taken seriously? Would Israel's military successes in the region encourage Saudi Arabia to accelerate this development? How would the Netanyahu government react to such a development?
So first, I haven't heard that Trump has promised or vowed to give Saudi Arabia nuclear weapons capability. I've heard of American companies getting involved in the civilian part of what Saudi Arabia hopes to do in the nuclear area, civilian part, generation of electricity and so forth. So that's what I know, and that was something Biden started. From what I understand, that wasn't something that Trump came up. That was part of the overall discussions in terms of how to get Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords. The United States would try to give incentives to the Saudis. One of them was the idea of nuclear cooperation. But last point I make, Kilic, on the issue of Saudi Arabia weaponizing or anybody else weaponizing, I suspect the same rule will apply to them. Nobody should weaponize. I mean, my reading is, my bottom line as of right now, might be wrong, that Israel wouldn't want any country. And that's been the history of Israel, going back to the Egyptian nuclear missile program, the 50s. No country is going to be allowed to have a nuclear weapon in the region, because if they do, then suddenly what Israel has in terms of ability to project power across the broader region will be gone. And therefore, Saudi Arabia, UAE, closest friend of Israel, essentially, none of these countries will be allowed to do that. And I'm sure that the same intelligence capabilities of Israel that has been so amazingly successful in what they do in Iran, they will be able to see what these countries, if they decide to go down the path of a nuclear program with a weapons component to it, they will discover that and they will stop it probably the same exact way, effectively as they did the Iranian program.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for Daniel to join us. And thanks for our viewers, both on social media and Zoom here. And hope to see you again in our next meeting and panel. Thank you very much.